The starving predator. The twin moons of Orion 4 shone dimly over the colony, casting long shadows across the empty streets. It was past midnight, and most of the settlers had locked their doors, whispering about the recent disappearances. Dr. Ethan Cross sat alone in his small clinic on the outskirts of town, flipping through his worn-out medical logs. The past week had been strange. 5 cases of extreme blood loss, no visible wounds, and no memory of what had happened. His patients had been found unconscious, pale as ghosts, their bodies drained of strength. The local security force called it a disease. Ethan knew better. Something was out there. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. Ethan sighed and rubbed his temples. There were no patterns, no clues, just fear. Until tonight. Because tonight, something came to him. The arrival. A heavy thud echoed from outside the clinic. Ethan tensed. It sounded like something collapsing. He stood up, cautiously grabbing the plasma knife he kept under his desk. Too many strange things had happened lately. Slowly, he walked toward the door and pushed it open. The night air was cold against his skin. And then he saw her. A figure lay sprawled near the entrance, half hidden in the darkness. A woman, but not human. Even in the dim light, Ethan could see the metallic sheen of her skin, the strange markings running along her arms, glowing faintly like dying embers. Her breathing was ragged, shallow, weak. Ethan knelt beside her. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered open. And then he saw her eyes. Deep red, glowing, predatory, and full of hunger. A monster or a victim. Ethan's grip on the plasma knife tightened. She was one of them. The stories he had heard, the warnings from the other settlers. A vampire. Not the kind from old human legends, but something real. A species that fed on blood. A species that had once been feared across the galaxy. She was trying to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. Please. Ethan hesitated. He should run. Call security. She was dangerous, but she was also dying. And then, in the pale moonlight, he noticed something else. Tears. They slid down her cheeks, mixing with the dirt on her face. Ethan had seen desperate people before, people on the edge of death. This wasn't just hunger. This was agony. She shivered violently. Her fingers dug into the ground, as if she were trying to hold on to reality itself. Ethan made a choice. A reckless, human choice. He reached forward and carefully lifted her into his arms. Her body was ice cold. She flinched, as if expecting pain. Instead, Ethan simply whispered, "Let's get you inside." The impossible decision. Ethan placed her on the examination table. The clinic lights buzzed softly, casting a glow over her features. She was alien, but not monstrous. Her face was sharp, elegant, framed by dark strands of hair. But her lips were cracked, her skin dry and dull. Her body was failing. Ethan scanned her with his med device. Her vitals were dropping. She was starving, and there was only one thing that could save her. She opened her eyes again, her gaze locking onto his wrist, where his veins pulsed. Ethan understood immediately. Her hunger, her fear. She was trying to fight it. "Do it," he said, shocking even himself. She flinched. "And no, I will. Lose control." Ethan exhaled. "Then take just enough." Her breathing became uneven. I can't." Ethan rolled up his sleeve. Her eyes widened. "This is insane," she whispered. "Maybe," Ethan said, "but you're dying." The room was silent. Then she moved. Slow, careful, her cold fingers wrapped around his wrist. Ethan didn't flinch. He saw the pain in her eyes, the shame, the desperation. And then he felt the bite. The first taste, pain. A sharp, piercing sensation, like 2 burning needles sinking into his skin. Then warmth, Ethan expected agony, expected weakness, but instead, he felt her presence. A wave of emotions crashed into him. Memories, fears, loneliness. He saw glimpses of a ruined world, a planet set ablaze. A girl, this girl, watching everything she knew disappear. She pulled away with a sharp gasp, stumbling back. Her hands trembled. Her body was no longer cold. Her eyes, still glowing, stared at him with something new. Shock. You, she whispered. You're still standing. Ethan flexed his fingers. He should feel weak, lightheaded. Instead, he felt fine. Stronger, even. What just happened? He asked. She swallowed hard. I don't know. But she did know. Something was different about his blood. Something that had never happened before. And it would change everything. The human's offer. Ethan's pulse was steady, too steady. He looked down at his wrist, where she had bitten him. The two small punctures were already closing, the skin knitting together far faster than it should have. That wasn't normal. Across the room, Ceres, because that was her name, he had glimpsed it in the flood of emotions when she fed, stood motionless, staring at him as if he were something impossible. You should be unconscious, she whispered. Or worse. Ethan flexed his fingers. But he wasn't. In fact, he felt stronger, sharper. His senses tingled, like his body had just been supercharged. His gaze flicked to Ceres. Something about his blood had changed her too. Her skin, which had been deathly pale, now had a strange, luminous glow. Her once weak posture was straight, her breathing steady. The hunger in her eyes had dulled, but something else lingered there. Confusion, fear, and something dangerously close to hope. Ceres took a shaky step back. What are you? Ethan let out a short, breathy laugh. You tell me. You're the one who just drank my blood. Ceres swallowed, as if tasting the remnants of it still in her mouth. Her expression flickered. This isn't possible. Ethan leaned against the exam table, rubbing the faint scar on his wrist. Yeah, well, that makes two of us. The impossible truth. Ceres was no longer starving, but her hands still trembled. She turned away from him, pacing the small clinic. Ethan could tell she was running through 100 thoughts at once, none of them good. Explain, he said. She shook her head. I can't. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Try. Ceres exhaled. Then, after a long silence, she finally spoke. My kind, we don't just drink blood, she said quietly. We consume the essence inside it. Strength, life force, memories. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Memories. Ceres hesitated, then nodded. That's how I knew your name before you told me. Ethan stiffened. That flash of emotions, the images, she had seen inside his mind. His jaw tightened. Stay out of my head. Ceres looked almost insulted. Do you think I wanted to see? She crossed her arms, her voice suddenly sharp. Do you think I wanted to know how it feels to lose someone? Ethan inhaled sharply. His fingers twitched. She had seen his past. The war, the people he couldn't save. His stomach clenched. He hated that she knew. Ceres lowered her gaze, her voice softer. That's why this doesn't make sense. After feeding, I should have absorbed some of your energy, taken something from you. She met his eyes. But I didn't. Instead, you gave something to me. Ethan blinked. What? Ceres pressed her fingers to her temples, as if even saying it hurt her. Your blood. It didn't just sustain me. It restored me. Ethan frowned. And that's weird. Ceres let out a dry laugh. It's impossible. Human blood is weak. It should barely keep me alive. But yours. She glanced at her own hands, flexing her fingers as if feeling her strength return. Yours is different. The offer. Ethan rubbed a hand down his face. So let me get this straight. He gestured at his wrist. I just let a starving alien vampire drink my blood. And now we're both fine. Cirrus gave him a look. I wouldn't say fine. Ethan let out a breath. He should be panicking, but strangely, he wasn't. His doctor's brain was already trying to process the facts. A vampire-like alien species exists. They need blood to survive. His blood was different, powerful, even. And that last part, that was very, very bad. Because if Cirrus figured it out, others would too. And then, they'd come for him. Cirrus suddenly tensed, her head snapping toward the clinic door. Ethan frowned. What? Then he heard it. A low, unnatural growl. Something was outside. Cirrus went rigid. Her voice was barely a whisper. They're here. Ethan's pulse spiked. Who? She turned to him, her red eyes burning with a single warning. Run. The bonding curse. The clinic's walls shook as something slammed into the door. Ethan tensed, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, a predator's growl. Across the room, Cirrus looked frozen in place. Not out of fear, out of recognition. They found me, she whispered. Ethan clenched his jaw. Who? Cirrus turned to him, her red eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before. Dread. My kind. Another thunderous crash. The clinic door dented inward. Whoever was out there wasn't knocking anymore. Ethan grabbed her arm. We need to move. Cirrus didn't resist. She was already backing away. The door buckled. A set of clawed fingers curled through the opening. Then a voice. Cold, hollow, hungry. Cirrus, you can't hide forever. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. Whoever this was, they weren't just here to retrieve her. They were here to consume her. Cirrus grabbed Ethan's wrist. This way. The door exploded inward. The escape. They ran. Through the back of the clinic, through dark alleyways slick with rain. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them. Heavy footsteps, deep growls, the scent of something unnatural filling the air. Cirrus wasn't just fast. She was moving like a shadow, weaving through the darkness effortlessly. Ethan, however, was human. He wasn't built for this. His breath came hard and fast, his legs burning. Cirrus glanced back. Keep up. Ethan scowled. I don't, exactly, have vampire speed. Cirrus muttered something under her breath. Then, suddenly, she grabbed him. Before Ethan could protest, she threw him over her shoulder and leaped. Ethan barely had time to react as she scaled a building in seconds, leaping across rooftops with terrifying agility. The colony lights blurred below them, a howling wind rushing past his ears. Not how I expected my night to go, he yelled. Cirrus didn't answer. She was focused on escaping. But then she stopped, and Ethan felt it too. A pulse. Not physical. Something else. Something that sent a strange vibration through his chest. His breath caught. His vision flickered. And for a split second, he saw through her eyes. The bond awakens. Ethan wasn't standing on a rooftop anymore. He was somewhere else. A planet burned before him. Red skies. Shadows stretching across dead cities. He saw ships falling from the heavens. And he saw Cirrus. Not the weak, starving woman he had met, but a warrior, a survivor, standing in the ruins of her world, surrounded by those who had once been her people, now twisted, monstrous things. And then they turned on her. The vision shattered. Ethan gasped, stumbling back onto the rooftop. His head spun, his body buzzing with energy. Cirrus stared at him, her expression unreadable. She knew. You felt it, didn't you? She whispered. Ethan swallowed hard. What the hell was that? Cirrus didn't answer right away. Her hands were trembling. When I fed on you, she said slowly, I didn't just take blood. I took something else. Ethan's chest tightened. What do you mean? Cirrus took a deep breath, Then she said the words that would change everything. "We're bonded now." The bonding curse. Ethan's mind raced. Bonded. He didn't like the sound of that. Cirrus nodded. It shouldn't have happened, not with a human. Ethan exhaled sharply. And what does that mean exactly? Something tells me it's not just a fancy word for allies. Cirrus hesitated. Then, finally, she told him the truth. "My kind don't just drink blood," she said. "We take something deeper. Strength, power, memories." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, you mentioned that part." Cirrus's eyes darkened. "But there's one rule," she whispered. "We never drink from each other, because when we do, we become connected, bound, forever." Ethan's stomach turned. Forever. "So what happens to us now?" he asked. Cirrus bit her lip. "I don't know." And that was the worst part. Because if she didn't know, then no one did. The bond between them was something new. Something unnatural. Something dangerous. And far below, in the streets of the colony, the hunters were still searching. Ethan had a feeling they wouldn't like what they found. The hunt begins. The air was thick with tension. Cirrus and Ethan weren't alone anymore. Somewhere below them, the hunters were still searching. Their footsteps echoed in the dark streets, slow and deliberate. They weren't in a rush. They knew their prey was trapped. Ethan's fingers twitched. His mind was still reeling from what Cirrus had just told him. Bonded. Forever. The word burned in his skull. He didn't sign up for this. He was a doctor, not some blood-bound supernatural experiment. But the moment Cirrus fed on him, something had changed. Something deep inside him. And now, he could feel her. Not just see her, feel her. Every breath she took, every movement she made, even her fear. It thrummed in his veins like a second heartbeat, like an invisible thread connecting them. Ethan exhaled sharply. "All right. Let's pretend for a second I'm not freaking out about the whole bonded forever thing." He looked at Cirrus. "How do we get out of this?" Cirrus didn't answer immediately. She was listening. The hunters below were getting closer. Too close. Cirrus's eyes flashed red. She was done running. The predator awakens. Cirrus turned to Ethan. "You still have that scalpel." Ethan blinked. "Seriously." Cirrus held out her hand. "Just give it to me." Ethan hesitated, then pulled the scalpel from his jacket. Cirrus took it, twirling it between her fingers. It looked ridiculously small in her hands. She closed her eyes. And then something shifted. The air around her darkened. A pulse of energy rippled through the rooftop. Ethan felt it, deep in his bones. Something ancient, something hungry. Then her eyes snapped open, and she wasn't the same anymore. Ethan swallowed. "Okay. That's new." Cirrus smirked. "Stay here." And before he could argue, she leaped off the roof. Ethan rushed to the edge, watching as Cirrus landed silently in the alley below. The hunters barely had time to react. She moved like a shadow, like liquid night. The first hunter barely had time to turn before Cirrus was on him. The scalpel flashed, a clean slice across the tendons of his leg. He went down without a sound. The second hunter lunged, but Cirrus was faster. She dodged, spun behind him, and sank her fangs into his throat. Ethan felt it. Not just saw it, felt the rush of energy flood through her. The power, the hunger. It was overwhelming. He stumbled back, his head spinning. What the hell? Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. Cirrus straightened, wiping the blood from her lips. Her glowing eyes met Ethan's, and for the first time, he saw something that terrified him. Hers wasn't the only hunger anymore. Ethan could feel something stirring inside himself. Something alien. Something calling to her. And she felt it too. Her expression flickered. "Ethan, what did you do to me?" Ethan exhaled, his hands trembling. "I was just about to ask you the same thing." Because whatever was happening to him, it wasn't stopping. And that meant something bigger was coming. Something neither of them could escape. The betrayal. The alley was silent. The two hunters lay motionless on the ground, their bodies drained, their weapons clattering uselessly beside them. Sarah stood over them, breathing hard, her glowing eyes still burning with hunger. But it wasn't the same as before. It was controlled. Ethan should have been terrified. He had just watched her kill two highly trained enforcers like they were nothing. But instead, he felt it. The rush of energy when she fed. The surge of power that ran through her, and somehow it ran through him too. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to shake the sensation. It wasn't just in his head. Something inside him was waking up. Saris turned to face him. You felt it again, didn't you? Ethan exhaled. Yeah. Saris stepped closer. That shouldn't be possible. Ethan forced a smirk. Yeah, well, a lot of things shouldn't be possible. And yet here we are. She didn't smile back. Because this wasn't funny. They both knew it now. This wasn't just a bond. This was a transformation. Ethan wasn't just connected to Saris anymore. He was changing. And they had no idea what he was becoming. The escape plan. Saris finally turned away, scanning the alley. We can't stay here. More will come. Ethan rubbed his temples. Yeah, and since I don't have vampire speed, where exactly are we running to? Saris hesitated. Then she said something Ethan did not expect. I know someone who can get us off-world. Ethan blinked. Wait, off-world? As in, leaving the planet. Saris nodded. Ethan exhaled. Okay. Yeah. Let's ignore the part where I have no idea how intergalactic travel works. Who's this mystery person? Saris hesitated. Then, Captain Rowe. Ethan's stomach dropped. Rowe, as in Commander Rowe of the Colony Defense Forces. Saris nodded. He runs operations outside the colony. He owes me a favor. Ethan let out a dry laugh. Oh, fantastic. The guy in charge of border security just so happens to be your contact. Why am I not surprised? Saris met his eyes. Do you trust me? Ethan hesitated. Did he? A week ago, she had been a half-dead predator on the edge of starvation. Now she was offering him a way out. But something in his gut screamed this wasn't going to go smoothly. Still, he had no choice. Let's go, he said. The deal. The meeting point was an abandoned hangar near the outer sector. The building was rusted, half buried under dust storms and forgotten cargo. Rowe was already there when they arrived. Tall, broad-shouldered, with military precision in his every movement. His uniform wasn't official, not anymore. He had the look of a man who had seen too much, and maybe done worse. You're late, Rowe said. Saris didn't flinch. I wasn't followed. Rowe's gaze flicked to Ethan. And this is? Saris hesitated. A complication. Rowe smirked. You always did attract trouble. Ethan stepped forward. Yeah, hi. I'm standing right here. Rowe ignored him. So, you need a way off-world. Saris nodded. We'll pay. Rowe studied her for a long moment. Then he said, I already sold your location. The room froze. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Betrayal. Saris moved first. Her fangs flashed as she lunged. But Rowe was faster. A sonic blast slammed into her chest, throwing her across the hangar. Ethan barely had time to react before the doors burst open. Armed enforcers flooded in. Weapons raised. A voice echoed through the hangar. Calm, calculated, deadly. You thought you could run, Saris. Ethan turned. And there he was. The bounty hunter. Dressed in black armor, a scar running down his cheek. His name was Cal Orvik, and he was here to finish the hunt. Ethan clenched his fists. Something inside him flared. For the first time, he didn't feel fear. He felt something else. Something dangerous. Something hungry. And he wasn't sure if it was his, or Saris, because maybe they weren't separate anymore. Maybe they were becoming one. The last stand. The hangar pulsed with tension. Kel Orvik stood at the entrance, flanked by enforcers in black armor, their weapons humming with lethal energy. Cirrus was still on the ground, stunned from Ro's betrayal. And Ethan? Ethan should have been terrified. Instead, he felt something dark, something powerful crawling through his veins. He wasn't the same man who had stepped into this hangar. Orvik's gaze landed on Cirrus. You gave us quite the chase, Bloodborne. Ethan's fists clenched. Bloodborne. That's what they called her kind. A relic of a forgotten war. A predator the galaxy feared. Orvik tilted his head. And you, his eyes locked onto Ethan, are an anomaly. The bounty hunter took a slow step forward. I've hunted your kind for years, but I've never seen one like you. Ethan exhaled. He could feel Cirrus's presence inside him. The bond between them wasn't just a connection anymore. It was changing him. And Orvik knew it. You feel it, don't you? Orvik smirked. That hunger inside you. It's not human. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He wasn't sure if Orvik was wrong. The predator awakens. Ro crossed his arms. We had a deal, Orvik. You wanted the Bloodborne, not him. Orvik's smirk didn't fade. Plans change. Cirrus groaned, forcing herself up. Her gaze locked onto Ethan. She saw it. The shift. The way his stance had changed. The way his breathing was too steady. The way his eyes weren't entirely human anymore. Cirrus staggered to her feet, eyes burning red. Ethan, whatever happens, don't let them take you. Ethan exhaled. He wasn't planning on it. Orvik raised his weapon. Stand down, human. Ethan tilted his head. You don't get it, do you? Something snapped inside him. His vision sharpened. His heartbeat slowed. The room felt clearer. And then he moved. Faster than any human should. Orvik barely had time to react before Ethan was on him. A human no more. Orvik fired. Ethan dodged. His body moved instinctively, unnaturally. A surge of raw power pulsed through him as he grabbed Orvik's wrist and twisted. Bones cracked. Orvik grunted in pain, staggering back. His men hesitated. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ro cursed. What the hell is he? Cirrus's voice was low, dangerous. He's bonded. Orvik's expression darkened. Then he's a threat. The enforcers opened fire. Ethan didn't think. He reacted. The world blurred as he moved, ducking, weaving, dodging with impossible speed. He slammed into the nearest enforcer, ripping the weapon from his hands and turning it back on them. Cirrus joined the fight, her movements a blur of shadows and fangs. For the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't the weak one in the room. He was the predator, and the enforcers knew it. The final choice. The battle was chaos. Cirrus tore through their ranks like a storm. Ethan's newfound reflexes made him untouchable. And Orvik. The bounty hunter was losing. He fell to one knee, breathing hard. You think this changes anything? Ethan wiped blood from his lip. Yeah, I do. But then, Ro pulled a hidden switch. The hangar trembled. Cirrus's eyes widened. Ethan, it's a trap. The roof began to collapse. Ethan turned to Cirrus. She wasn't fast enough to escape. Not alone. And Ethan knew what he had to do. Becoming something new. Ethan reached for her. The bond flared. And for the first time, he let go. The hunger inside him surged. He felt his strength triple. His vision burned red. Cirrus gasped. She felt it too. And then, Ethan moved. He grabbed Cirrus and launched them both through the collapsing ceiling. They crashed through metal and stone, bursting into the open air as the hangar caved in below. Ro and Orvik were buried beneath the wreckage. Ethan and Cirrus landed on a rooftop, panting. The dust settled. The battle was over. But the real war had just begun. The unspoken truth. Ethan stared at his hands. They were still trembling. Sarah stepped forward, her voice quiet. You saved me. Ethan looked up at her. His irises still glowed faintly. I don't think I'm human anymore, he whispered. Sarah swallowed. You're not. The bond was complete. Ethan Cross was no longer just a doctor. He was something new, something that shouldn't exist. And somewhere in the wreckage below, Cal Orvik was still alive, watching, waiting. And he knew one thing for certain. The galaxy had just changed forever. The final stand. The city stretched beneath them, a maze of flickering neon lights and distant sirens. Ethan stood on the rooftop, breathing hard. His body was different now. He could feel it. The rush of energy, the heightened senses, the raw power thrumming under his skin. Sarah stood beside him, watching carefully. You feel it, don't you? She murmured. Ethan clenched his fists. Yeah. He wasn't just bonded anymore. He was something else. Something the galaxy had never seen before. The war had just begun. Cirrus turned away. We need to go. Ethan frowned. Where? Cirrus's eyes darkened. There's only one place left, the homeworld of my kind, if any of them are still alive. Ethan exhaled. And if they're not? She hesitated. Then we're alone in this war. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Ethan knew she was right. They couldn't stay here. But as they turned to leave, a voice echoed from the streets below. You think you can run from this? Ethan's blood ran cold. Cal Orvik was still alive. He stood in the wreckage of the hangar, bloodied but standing tall. His visor flickered with red warnings. His armor was dented, damaged, but his weapon was still aimed at them. You don't understand what you've done, Cross, Orvik growled. Ethan met his gaze. Oh, I think I do. Orvik's grip on his rifle tightened. No, you don't. The final confrontation. Cirrus grabbed Ethan's arm. We need to leave. Ethan didn't move. Something inside him burned. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was done running. I'll hold him off, Ethan murmured. Cirrus's eyes widened. Are you insane? You're not ready. Ethan looked at his hands. The power inside him was still growing. Maybe he wasn't ready, but he wasn't the same weak human who had taken in a dying predator days ago. And if Orvik wanted to stop them, he'd have to kill them first. The fight that changed everything. Orvik fired first. Ethan moved, instinctively, impossibly fast. The plasma bolt shot past him, missing by inches. He closed the distance between them in a second, his body reacting before his mind could even think. Orvik's eyes widened. What the hell? Ethan punched straight through his chest plate. The bounty hunter stumbled back, coughing. But he didn't go down. Instead, he laughed. I was right. You're not human anymore. Ethan gritted his teeth. And you're not walking away from this. Orvik smirked. No, but neither are you. Then, he activated the beacon on his wrist. Ethan's stomach dropped. A planetary distress signal. Orvik's voice was hoarse but triumphant. They're coming, Cross, he murmured. And they won't stop until they have you. Ethan felt a chill run through him. This wasn't just about Cirrus anymore. Now, they were coming for him too. Becoming the impossible. Orvik collapsed, unconscious, defeated. But his message had already been sent. Cirrus grabbed Ethan's wrist. We need to go. Now. Ethan hesitated. He looked down at his hands, hands that weren't entirely human anymore. A week ago, he had been just a doctor. Now he was the thing the galaxy feared. Cirrus's voice was quiet. You have a choice, Ethan. He met her eyes, and he knew she was right. He could keep running, hide, try to pretend he was still the same person he used to be. Or he could fight, not just for himself, not just for Cirrus, but for something bigger. Ethan took a deep breath. And then he made his choice. Let them come, he whispered. Cirrus smiled. And together, they vanished into the night. This was just the beginning. Ethan stood at the edge of the rooftop, staring into the endless night. The city below was alive, oblivious to the war that had just begun. Sarah stood beside him, her red eyes glowing in the dark. "They'll come for us." Ethan exhaled slowly. "I know." A distant rumble echoed in the sky. Ships arriving. The hunt wasn't over. Sarah tilted her head. "Are you afraid?" Ethan looked at his hands, feeling the strange power pulsing through his veins, the part of him that was no longer human. He smirked. "Not anymore." Then, without another word, they disappeared into the shadows, because the galaxy wasn't ready for what they had just become. And this was only the beginning, the end.